Story 1. I was convinced in elementary school that it was extremely easy to catch on fire. We practiced stop, drop, and roll so often. Story 2. I thought physical models of the solar system showed a distance scale. I was an adult before I learned that my young science fair self would have had to place the correctly scaled objects a football field apart for the model to be accurate. Story 3. I thought you had to be married to make babies, laughing out loud. I figured your body somehow knew you were married and acted accordingly. I was very young. Story 4. I thought Alaska was an island because on maps it appears in its own section. It was a humiliating discovery, and my friends still remind me. Story 5. My family was the exception rather than the rule, but I did not know until I was about 19. Culture shock was an understatement. I thought siblings not getting along and parents fighting were television tropes. I never even heard my parents raise their voices once. They always showed compassion for each other, for my sister, and for me. They ran a business that paid staff at least 20% above market rates, paid a generous profit share in profitable years, and treated employees like family. I thought all this was normal. When I entered the workforce, it was a rude awakening to discover that most businesses are owned and run by arseholes. Story 6. I thought 2-day weekends were only for kids in school. My father worked 6 days a week my whole life, so I assumed adults lose a weekend day. Story 7. As a child, I used to think that when you gave the cashier money at the store, they gave you even more money in return. Story 8. Salaried workers receive their salary once a year. I grew up in a financially comfortable family, so I only once heard my dad say it was payday. When my older brother got his first job, he received a payslip every 2 weeks. My dad earned a certain amount a year, and my brother earned a certain amount an hour, and I had never seen my dad with a payslip. I assumed that if you were paid an hourly wage, you were paid based on hours worked every 2 weeks or monthly. But if you were salaried, you received an annual amount. Story 9. The so-called super salad turned out to be servers asking whether guests wanted soup or salad. Story 10. We had to make ends meet because we were poor and could only afford meat. Story 11. If you touched a bird's egg and put it back in the nest, the mother would not sit on it. Reddit taught me that I was very wrong about this. Story 12. I believed evolution was false because my school taught it was false. One reason was that we did not evolve from monkeys. It is true that we did not evolve from monkeys. I now understand that no one arguing for evolution claims we did. Even if my school claimed we came from apes, the conclusion they wanted would still have been that evolution is false, so I repeated that claim until I was 22. Then I sincerely asked on Reddit for an explanation of evolution. People assumed I was the kind of Christian who asks questions only to dismiss any answers, which is something I used to do. Not this time. A Reddit user whose future career relates to the topic messaged me privately and patiently cleared up my misunderstandings. I was not completely convinced immediately, but the conversation gave me what I needed to think it through and ultimately accept evolution over time. Story 13. Through the overzealous anti-drug campaigns of the 1980s and 1990s, I became convinced that random people on the street would come up to me at any moment and trick me into trying free drugs. That belief was false. Turns out I have never been offered free drugs. Story 14. I was way too old when I found out that an opening parachute does not pull the parachutist back into the air. The cameraman falls past the parachutist. Story 15. I grew up thinking politicians were the smartest people in the country and were there for the good of society. Story 16. Not a misunderstanding. Falsified data, more like it. Evidence of Santa Claus was presented to me, and I trusted it. I was wrong. Story 17. When I was 8, I saw a teenage girl squat to urinate behind some bushes, and for a long time I thought girls urinated from their buttocks. True story. Story 18. I thought my grandma personally knew Jesus. She kept a list of names and numbers by the phone. While snooping through her things, I found the list. Because she was a devout Catholic, I never doubted it. When I asked her about it, she said, "No, Mija. It's Jesus' number." Jesus was a family member. Story 19. The word squeamish was misread as screamish. For example, werewolves make me squeamish. Story 20. I don't know how long I believed it, but we have a particular factory that emits white vapor constantly. There are warning signs about it obscuring driving conditions during the colder months. As a child, I thought it was the cloud factory. They made clouds. I remember the sad day I told my mother, and she said that was not what they made there. She was kind and probably thought it was adorable, but I was bummed. Story 21. When I was moving my family into our apartment years ago, a drunk man down the hall kept coming over, glaring at me and complaining. As I was finishing, when he was completely sloshed, he came over and yelled that the building was going to shit with people like me moving in. For the next few years, I was passive-aggressive toward him when it was safe, mostly by closing elevator and building entrance doors on him when he was right behind me and by glaring a lot. One day, after a couple of years, he ran up and slammed his arm in the front door before I could close it. I thought he was going to kill me. He demanded, "What is your problem? Why do you hate me so much?" "You know," I said, "I have no idea." I told him, still angry. He replied, "I'm sorry someone said that to you, but it was not me. I do not even live on your floor. I will show you my apartment if you do not believe me." I had mixed up two similar-looking white men and had been a total jerk to this random neighbor for years. I felt terrible, apologized a lot, and we occasionally chatted and got along until he moved out a few years later. Story 22. I used to think everyone told the truth and had good intentions. Story 23. I was told in 4th grade that dogs had sensitive noses. I didn't understand that this referred to their sense of smell and thought for years that their little noses physically hurt at the slightest touch. Story 24. I thought royal families only existed in the movies I watched because companies like Disney made things up, such as mice that walked on 2 legs and dogs that talked. I was very shocked when Princess Diana died when I was 7, because I learned that royalty not only existed but could die like everyone else. Story 25. I used to believe you had to wash your face with freezing cold water. When I was younger, I saw videos of people splashing cold water on their faces and calling it refreshing, so I thought you had to do that every time you washed your face. No one corrected me for years. Story 26. I thought the Wright brothers, inventors of the airplane in British English, were black. I believed that until I was about 16 or 17. I think it stems from being read a picture book about them in 1st grade. The illustrations were a little artsy and not very clear, and the Wright brothers were painted the same color as the only black child in the class, Lucas, so I assumed it was accurate. I went through my entire youth thinking they were black. I kind of forgot about racism and segregation, or at least I never connected the dots to realize something did not quite seem right. To be honest, I still prefer to think of them as great black inventors. Why? No clue. 2 black men invented the airplane, and I will gaslight myself on this until I die. Story 27. Another one I just remembered. I was very fond of Laura Ingalls Wilder in kindergarten through 2nd grade, and I had a nasty case of strep throat that developed into scarlet fever. It was miserable, 0 out of 10 for the record. I was sure I would go blind like Mary in the books, so during my recovery I spent weeks secretly learning to navigate by touch with my eyes closed, even locating condiments in the kitchen to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I was an odd child. Don't get me started on the hamster saga. Story 28. I used to think ponies were just young horses. I believed that well into adulthood. Story 29. As a child, I thought yard sales were exactly that. People selling their yards because they were too poor to keep them. When my parents started chatting about having one, I went straight to defense condition 5 and threw a huge fit to prevent it. I did not want to be known as the poor kid on the block, and I did not want to ask the new owners for permission to play in the yard. Story 30. For years I believed that goldfish only have a 3-second memory. It was one of those things everyone repeated, so it felt true. Later I learned it's completely wrong. Goldfish can remember things for months, recognize routines, and even be trained. Story 31. I have to put in a plug for the This American Life episode titled A Little Bit of Knowledge. It spends a lot of time on this sort of thing and is one of the best episodes they have ever done in my opinion. Story 32. I believed that swallowing watermelon seeds would make trees grow in my stomach. Story 33. My teacher said that there was a small rock that weighed as much as mountains. I spent years imagining it crushing cities and believed it was real. It turned out to be just a metaphor. Story 34. When I was very young, I overheard someone say that color was not invented until the 1950s. They were talking about televisions, but I did not realize this, and for several years I believed everything before the 1950s was black and white. I would often wonder how they got up high enough to paint the sky and other silly things. Story 35. I thought when people said euthanasia, they meant youth in Asia, as in teenagers in Asia. I didn't understand why they were controversial. Since I vaguely knew about the Tiananmen Square protests, I figured it had something to do with that. I also thought the word immediately was spelled and pronounced immediately. It took until freshman year to realize otherwise. Story 36. I thought mortgage pre-approval only happened after you had rented an apartment for a while, and that mortgages required a 20% down payment with no option to put down less. Story 37. When I was very young, I learned about murder for the first time and thought, thank goodness that does not happen anymore. It seemed like something from the past, like chamber pots. Story 38. Based on a discredited study, I believe childhood vaccines caused autism. I refused to vaccinate my child until I realized I was wrong. I caught up on the vaccinations, and my healthy child will soon be 27. Story 39. Not sure if this counts, as it was not exactly a belief, but until I was about 20 years old, I did not realize that sardines and anchovies were distinct. I did not even know there were two separate words, sardine and anchovy, both referring to small fish often found in cans or jars. My mistake dawned on me while shopping with my wife for ingredients for a Caesar salad. I needed anchovies, of course, and grabbed a can of sardines. My wife said, "I thought you needed anchovies." I replied, "Yeah, they're right here," holding up the can of sardines, when she said, "Those are sardines, not anchovies." It felt as if one word and one fish split into two. It had minimal impact on my life other than giving me an anecdote about how the brain works. I conceived of only a single interchangeable word and fish up until that point. The words and concepts of sardine and anchovy were not distinct. Sardines and anchovies were small fish that you ground into Caesar salad dressing, put on pizza, grilled and eaten whole, or served on crackers, whatever you do with either but not usually both. Story 40. When I was a kid, I thought Queen Latifah was an actual queen of a country. Story 41. America was a land of goodness and purity, and we stood for the light in every way. I am 78. Story 42. I grew up in Chile during a 17-year military dictatorship. During my childhood and into my early teens, I believed that presidents remained in office until they died, like the Pope. Story 43. Don't laugh at me, but I thought that skin pigmentation was an example of sexual dimorphism in humans until I was at least 5. Let me explain. My mom is very white, practically glow-in-the-dark white. My dad was biracial. I am female and have lighter skin than my brothers. My father's mother and my uncle's wife had very light skin, and my female cousin has lighter skin than her brother. So I concluded that all women had lighter skin than all men. Then I saw a red-headed man at church one day and it shattered my worldview. I had no idea how I had failed to notice that I had a white grandfather and 2 white uncles on the other side of the family. I felt embarrassed. Story 44. I thought it didn't rain over the ocean. The little graphic in my school textbook showed water evaporating over the ocean, forming clouds that produced rain over the land, which then ran back to the ocean. I was 12 and on a boat at sea when it started raining. I lost my mind. I was a child who took things literally. I still get teased by my family about this. Story 45. I thought the phrase was for all intensive purposes instead of for all intents and purposes. I used it in college papers for 2 years before my roommate corrected me. Story 46. I thought left turns on red from one-way streets to other one-way streets were universal. They are not. Story 47. I thought I could be Asian eventually. I was a white kid in Denmark and all I wanted to be was a ninja or a samurai, whatever I thought those were. I did taekwondo quite religiously, and I believed that if I dedicated myself and trained well enough, I would eventually be like my favorite movie protagonists. I think I associated specific meditative, Zen, or stoic behavior strongly with a certain Asian look. I didn't register that it was a race so much. Somewhere around 10 or 11 I realized that was not how it worked, and the funny part was I became extremely existentially distraught. It threw a wrench into my plans for life. Even now, at 38 with a career and a child, I can still feel that sadness in my stomach, that what I really wanted is forever out of reach. Maybe if I got stupid rich, I could pull a Michael Jackson and try to make the dream come true. Story 48. I was told about periods by my extremely reserved mother. She told me you can bleed from anywhere, even down there. She said it would happen one day with no real explanation. I thought swimming would never happen again. I later found out what a real period was when I got mine at 8. Proper sex education is crucial. Story 49. When I was a child, I overheard my parents talking about how my father was very stressed because he had to fire someone. I heard the word fire and assumed it meant my father was going to shoot someone. When I asked, they explained that someone my father worked with had not done their job properly and would be dismissed. For several weeks, I believed my father was an executioner. Story 50. I was raised by my bougie parents to believe poor people were poor because they were lazy and stupid, and that anyone willing to work hard could become wealthy. Then I got my first low-wage job and realized low-wage workers work far harder than wealthy people. Many poor people are extremely smart, and many rich people are complete idiots. Story 51. I assumed that the moment you got married, your house was never messy again. That was a harsh lesson to learn. Story 52. When I was really young, I thought the notary public was a place like the Republic of Noda. Story 53. I believed strongly in trickle-down economics because my father explained it to me in a way that made sense to a 10-year-old. Story 54. When I was a kid, I thought you had to light a cigarette for every puff. Then I smoked my first and realized it burned the whole way. Story 55. I believed for a very long time that people from Pakistan did not use toilet paper and used their bare hands to wipe their buttocks. I later learned it was a lie told to me by my Indian parents and other elders to make me look down on them. Story 56. When I was about 8, I thought cancer spread through exposure to air. I believed that if surgery did not remove all of it, the remainder would spread quickly. I also thought a car was started by turning the steering wheel because our driveway was steep and you had to turn while backing up. Story 57. A different side of the same coin. Last month I realized his name is Josh Brolin. I had been pronouncing it as Brolim for 2 decades. Story 58. I used to think that school happened overnight. My brother left for school. I went to sleep, and when I woke up he was home again. I was afraid to go to school because I did not want to sleep away from home. I did not really understand time or naps for a long time. Story 59. American slavery was truly horrific. It took many years of my young adulthood to learn it was 100 times worse than I had been taught and truly inhumane and unforgivable. Story 60. It is remarkable how compassionate other species can be. I used to think only humans had the capacity to show compassion, but I have seen many videos of animals helping other species in peril. It is beautiful. Story 61. Growing up, I went to many Atlanta Braves games. As a child, I thought the end of the national anthem was, "And the home of the Braves," because I only ever heard it at those games. Story 62. I believed that fat people were somehow not as good, smart, or motivated as thin people. I was terrified of being fat. Story 63. I used to think the phrase walk of shame referred to exiting a public restroom stall after taking a particularly raunchy bowel movement. I did not learn the true meaning until my early 20s. Laughing out loud. Story 64. Seasonally appropriate, so I will add it. In the hymn, "O come, all ye faithful," one line reads, "Yea, Lord, we greet thee, born this happy morning." For years I thought it was, "Yea, Lord." I think my childhood interpretation was better. Story 65. I was taught growing up that neurons cannot regenerate and that once you lose them they are gone forever. Turns out that was not true. Regeneration is more limited than in other parts of the body. Story 66. If you swallowed gum, it would stay in your stomach for 7 years. Story 67. I thought all women just automatically grow babies without the assistance of a man, because that is how Jesus happened, so certainly that is how it works with every baby. At the grocery store with my dad, I announced that I was going to have a baby soon. This was great news. I was pregnant because I was a girl. The look of horror on my father's face and the immediate hostility from everyone in the store were shocking. I was 4. Story 68. I thought hospital services were free when I was a kid. I just assumed that if you got hurt, you would be taken to the hospital and they would heal you or make you feel better, in the sense of the community looking after each other. Of course, as I got older, I realized that was not the case. I discovered that insurance, copayments, and premiums exist. Laughing out loud. Story 69. As a kid in middle school, I asked my best friend who the lead singer of Aerosmith was. As a joke, she told me his name was Aerosmith and that the band was named after him. I took her at her word and never looked it up. Years later, as a master's student in music history, I was at a gathering of other music academics when they started talking about the history of pop music and rock and roll. I humiliated myself in front of my peers, teachers, and even my thesis advisor by referring to Aerosmith as the singer. Needless to say, I called my friend immediately. She gave me a hard time and laughed when I told her about this. I forgave her, and we are still best friends. Story 70. I'm not from the United Kingdom, but I watch a lot of British panel shows. I kept hearing about this celebrity, Anton Deck, but could never find anything. I searched Google and the Internet Movie Database and found nothing. It was weird because he seemed like a household name there. Then one day someone on the United Kingdom panel show's subreddit mentioned their favorite double act, Ant and December. I also didn't understand why people on the Graham Norton show would randomly wear apples on their lapels. It turns out they are poppies, and people in the United Kingdom understandably remember World War I more than people in the Ozarks do. Story 71. The length of a relationship does not indicate its stability. Story 72. I'm from Texas, where there are many strange town names. When I was a kid, I always thought Gunpoint was an actual town. When I heard the cashier was robbed at gunpoint on the news, I wondered why people kept going to this obviously very dangerous town. Story 73. I used to think climate change was caused by a natural cycle, since the planet experienced many such cycles long before humans existed. I changed my mind because the evidence that the current change is predominantly caused by human activity is very strong. Story 74. As a child, I heard the term dust bunnies and immediately pictured hamster-sized rabbits that rolled dust into balls like fluffy little dung beetles. I believed in them for about 10 years and hoped one day to catch one and keep it as a pet. My parents encouraged the fantasy because they thought it was cute. Story 75. For years I swore that Elton John needed Tony Danza to embrace him. Story 76. I thought you stopped being happy when you became an adult. Later I found out my dad was on Lexapro, an antidepressant, so he couldn't express much of anything. I spent many years fearing getting old, worried that one day it would click and I would suddenly be unable to do fun things like buy a cake and sleep in my backyard on a starry night. When I was less cynical, I thought doctors, politicians, and other professionals were superhuman in intelligence. Then I met some really foolish adults and realized people do not necessarily change as they grow older. Story 77. I used to think adults knew what they were doing. Turns out everyone is just freestyling life. Story 78. I always thought the expression "you can't have your cake and eat it too" was super dumb. Who would rather have a cake than eat it? Cakes are meant to be eaten. I was in my 30s before I understood what it actually meant. Story 79. As a child, I believed that if I went outside and stared at the television antenna, I could see pictures streaming into it. Not seeing those pictures did not diminish that belief for quite a while. Story 80. My grandmothers told me in the 1970s when I was a child that racism would die out with their generation. Story 81. My husband thought, growing up, that Royal Crown Cola was what people drank in the Royal Palace because Royal Crown sounds like it belongs in a palace. When his mother brought Royal Crown soda back in the day as the cheaper option, he believed they were serving something fancy, the drink of kings and queens. Story 82. I used to think weight loss and fitness only affected other people because I did not know much about them. I would leave the cheese off a burger and expect immediate results, or I would lift weights for 3 days, get bored, and then be frustrated that I did not see muscle. As I got older, I finally figured it out and achieved a nicely toned body that I am still happy with in my 40s. I look back and wish I had known this much sooner. Story 83. My dad spent most of his life thinking it was Apache fog that rolled into town in the mornings, as if it were named after the Apache people. It took him an embarrassingly long time to realize the morning radio hosts were saying, Apache fog. Story 84. In first grade, I thought black and white movies and television had no color because God had not yet invented color. Story 85. I thought electrolytes were useless or did not do anything because every sports drink commercial included the disclaimer that electrolytes are added for flavor only. While I was in the hospital, I drank a lot of blue Powerade and my doctors told me to stop because my electrolytes were unbalanced. I scoffed and said electrolytes do not do anything. I was 20. Story 86. Those sheep were born without tails. I then saw sheep in England that had tails like dogs. Story 87. The music on the radio came from bands and musicians at the radio building. They played a song and then the next group came in and took their place. Story 88. I thought a check was not legal unless you wrote it in cursive. Story 89. I was intensely afraid of quicksand and of being on fire until high school. I thought both would be bigger problems in my life given how much media attention they received in the late 1990s and the mid-2000s. Story 90. When I was a teenager, I thought drug use should be completely up to the individual. If someone wanted to do something foolish, I figured let them. Then a kid from the project spoke up in class and explained the problems drug users create for the people around them. I had no idea. That was the beginning of realizing I had led a sheltered life and had things to learn beyond being purely logical. Story 91. I'm worried this may sound racist, but it is not. Growing up, I heard newscasters use the phrase inner city. I truly thought they were saying N-word city, as if using a sanitized version of the N-word. I couldn't understand why they were being overtly racist and not just saying it outright. What was the point? When I later found out what they were really saying, I was relieved to realize I had just been a naive kid. Story 92. When I was a child, I knew there was no air in space and that astronauts were weightless. I concluded that the lack of air caused weightlessness. I thought that if I wore a spacesuit and you put me in a sealed room and pumped all the air out, I would float. At least one of my children thought the same. Story 93. I thought I was special or a genius because things came easily to me. It turned out I had been lucky to be in environments where the bar was low or the odds were in my favor. Realizing I am actually average was a brutal reality check. Story 94. I thought the tossed salad and scrambled eggs theme song from Frasier was sung by a very jolly black man. Story 95. When I was a kid, I once asked my mom the difference between the Republican and Democratic parties, and she said that Democrats love to spend money on good things, while Republicans like to save money. It did not register that she was talking about taxes and government spending, so I thought Democrats were a club of people who love shopping for nice things, and Republicans were a club of people who save money for cool things. I declared right then and there that I wanted to be both. Story 96. I thought that older adults and the government were looking out for and making decisions that prioritized the well-being of younger generations. Story 97. I believed everyone had a responsibility to try to be good. I eventually realized that people are what they are. Good people hold themselves responsible because they already are. They would have been good regardless. Social contracts do not exist and cannot be enforced. They are just nonsense adults tell young people to make them comply. Story 98. I have never seen an episode, but until a few years ago I thought the name of the television series was Downton Abbey. Story 99. Until 2 months ago, I thought there were 64 ounces in a gallon. I am 37 years old and overeducated in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Story 100. The media portrayed entire countries as evil, as if every resident would hate you if you went there. For example, all of Russia was painted as bad, and the same was done to many other countries. It took years to realize that much of this is perception and the result of poor leadership. People are people everywhere. They want to earn a living, live comfortably, and are generally kind and peace-seeking. Often the real problem is bad leaders, and the depths of modern geopolitics are even worse. Story 101. Born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, I grew up hearing people in movies and television talk about how cold things were, especially the windshield factor. That refers to how cold your windshield gets when it is very cold outside. It was not until my early teens that I finally read wind chill factor in print and realized my mistake. I am from Phoenix, so it is rarely very cold here. Story 102. Sorry, I can't help edit or transform sexual content that involves minors. I can help in other ways, for example, rewrite the passage as an age-appropriate, non-sexual memory focusing on curiosity and confusion. Rewrite it as an adult memory so the content is allowed. Produce a neutral, TTS-friendly version that removes explicit sexual details. Which of those would you like? Story 103. When we took world history, we all came away with the same basic beliefs about which behaviors we should not repeat as a species. The joke is on me. Story 104. Before the web, whenever Yusuf Islam was in the news, the story almost always began, Yusuf Islam, formerly known as Cat Stevens, best known for Cats in the Cradle. I once argued with a coworker about Cats in the Cradle before smartphones. At home, I searched online and found a note on his official page stating he had no connection to the song. He did not write, sing, or perform it in concert. The next day, I returned to work, apologized, and printed several news articles that wrongly credited the song to Cat Stevens for my coworker to read. Story 105. In medication commercials on television, there was always the disclaimer, do not take that medication if you are breastfeeding, pregnant, or trying to become pregnant. Growing up, I felt bad for my mother, a nurse who seemed to be banned from taking most medicines. Story 106. When my mom finally told me Santa Claus wasn't real, I had kind of suspected. I went through other unlikely candidates, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and she confirmed that yes, all those things were make-believe. I hadn't explicitly asked about God, but I assumed he was on the list. I was in middle school when my dad said something about God at the dinner table that only made sense if he actually believed. I laughed as if he had been joking, and everyone stared at me. What followed was the craziest conversation. I learned that people actually believed in gods. I had gone years assuming nobody did, that God was just another symbolic thing people talked about, but that was not real, maybe something believed in ancient times. So I arrived at my lack of faith not through college bong sessions but by accident. A total misunderstanding, like slipping on a banana peel. Story 107. I'm a never nude. I used to think there were dozens of us, but it turns out I'm the only one. Story 108. Emergency brake. As a kid, I thought you jumped on that other brake pedal right before you got into an accident. I was born in the late 1960s. Story 109. When I was very young, about 5, I thought both men and women could have babies. I was afraid to have one because I thought it would come out of my belly button. Story 110. I thought there was only one ice age and that is how all the dinosaurs died. Whoops. Story 111. I thought you could only marry someone you had gone to school with for your whole life, and I was crushed when a cute boy came to our school in 2nd grade because I would never be able to marry him. My parents still tease me about that, even 40 years later. Story 112. I thought cold medicine was made up until I was 17. My mother, a doctor, would give us allergy medicine whenever we were sick, and it worked amazingly well. I never realized this was uncommon until high school, when a friend said her mother made her take cold medicine. I laughed, thinking she was joking. Turned out I was the odd one out. I had never used it. I still have not, but at least I know they are real. Story 113. I asked my sister whether they put bells on railroad crossings so blind drivers would know to stop. She said blind people are not allowed to drive. I asked whether rumble strips on the road make the car produce a loud noise and vibration to let drivers know if they are still in the lane. Story 114. Secret Asian Man is actually Secret Agent Man. My coworkers now think I am stupid. Story 115. I thought facts were solidified universal truths and that scientific proof meant inflexible, infallible verification. Now I know it just means the best answer we could come up with for now. Factually speaking, is wine good for you? It depends on who is paying for the study. Story 116. I had a hard time with the pronunciation of words. I must have said Viet my knees until I was 32. No one corrected me for 32 years. Don't even get me started on the Milano cookie story. Story 117. When I went to the Marine recruiting office in 2002, it was because of September 11th, 2001. I was told that every Marine was a rifleman, meaning infantry. The recruiter said I had a great Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery score and qualified for any military occupational specialty, then asked me to choose 3 options. I looked at him confused and said, "A Marine." He asked which military occupational specialty I meant. I repeated, "A Marine." After a few seconds, he said, "You mean infantry?" I replied, "Yes, a Marine." I believed being a Marine meant holding a rifle and running to the front lines, and that belief was why I chose that branch. Story 118. I thought there were no rats in Alberta because it's too cold here. That was until I was 24, when I found out it was a policy decision and we have a rat patrol that maintains our rat-free status. Story 119. I used to think pears were a type of apple and that cauliflower was white broccoli. When I discovered those beliefs were false, I refused to eat pears or cauliflower for many years. Story 120. My dad jokingly told me Aunt Jemima, the maple syrup lady, was my real aunt. He even said we could visit her someday and eat pancakes together. I believed that for years. Story 121. Pretty much just religion. I am from a Laestadian family, and before a certain age I believed everything they told me about how the world works. We go to heaven, others go to hell, and so on. It is disturbing to remember that leaving the community and losing faith was treated as a tragedy, almost as if the person had died, and we were told to pray for them to regain the gift of faith. That talk traumatized me. Later, when I began to doubt my own faith, I lost sleep and cried over the thought of going to hell. I left the community and Laestadianism at 18, after several years of doubt. Ironically, high school religious studies helped me arrive at that decision. It was useful to hear a detached analysis of different religions and realize the one I belonged to was relatively small and niche. I still hold some beliefs from that background. I tell myself these are good ideas and practices, but that might be the indoctrination speaking. I feel at a disadvantage because I am missing many things that I am only slowly learning about how life works outside that community. Story 122. As a child, I thought that when new people moved into a house, they had swapped homes with the previous owners. Story 123. I thought I was a broken version of normal until I received my attention deficit hyperactivity disorder diagnosis. Story 124. Although I grew up in the North, I had a Civil War class in high school taught by someone from the South whose perspective reflected the lost cause of the Confederacy. He taught us that the Civil War was about states' rights and that the South was fighting for a noble way of life. Not everyone accepted this, but that was how he taught, and it took years and exposure to other perspectives before I let go of that false view. Story 125. When I was a kid, I thought salt cooled food down. I saw someone look at a plate of steaming hot food, pause to sprinkle salt on it, and then eat it. I knew eating very hot food was unpleasant, and I knew people spread salt to melt ice in winter, so my child brain made the connection. Story 126. The idea that you can catch a cold from cold weather is just a bunch of boomer nonsense. Story 127. Knowledge is power. France is bacon. Not me, but it's a meme. Story 128. I'd never want to be a member of any club that would have me as a member. Story 129. I thought you gained an hour of sleep every night during daylight saving time. Story 130. I thought it was patience is a virtue. Like averting your eyes to avoid seeing something. I was missing it. Story 131. I used to think Dave Matthews was into scat because I read a joke on a forum. It turned out they were joking about the time his tour bus dropped waste while crossing a bridge and hit a passing tour boat. Story 132. I thought that because my mom saved a certain amount on groceries, it would be up for grabs, so I always asked her for it. She gave me the coins from her change, which took me a while to notice. I argued, but it would have been gone anyway. Story 133. Until my junior year of high school, I believed the United States was the only country with a varied climate. I thought the rest of the world only matched stereotypes, such as Australia being scalding hot, Russia and Canada being cold and snowy, and South America being humid and hot. I was surprised to learn that it can snow in Australia and in parts of South America. Story 134. My mom told my three brothers and me when we were kids that if we were too loud while a cake was in the oven, the cake would fall. We had no idea what she meant, but it was the only time the four of us were quiet because we did not want to ruin the cake. I did not find out until my 30s that it was my mom's way of getting 30 minutes of peace and quiet. Story 135. As a child, I thought the world was black and white. This was because I watched old shows like The Andy Griffith Show, I Love Lucy, and The Honeymooners with my grandparents. One day, as I looked out the window while my mother was driving, I asked, "When did the world become color?" She looked puzzled and then had to convince me I was wrong. She still laughs and tells this story to this day. Story 136. I was homeschooled until the 8th grade. During that time, I watched a lot of Disney Channel and Nickelodeon, so I had a weird perspective on public school. I expected that when you went in, you would be the main character. You would find a friend or two to stick close to. Schools would have courtyard cafeterias, lots of open sunshine, and everyone would go to their lockers between classes. Teachers would be stern but fair. In 8th grade, my parents could not afford to continue homeschooling because they both had to get jobs after their home business of 15 years became irrelevant around 2006 to 2008 during the financial crisis. I was excited to attend school because I had an optimistic idea of what it would be. I was wrong. My school was predominantly poor minorities. I was a heavy-set white boy who had not seen the sun in years and had spent all my free time playing video games and watching bootleg anime on my computer. I adjusted, but the first year was very hard. High school was a better story for me. I was still awkward and adapting, but in the second semester of 8th grade, I lost a lot of weight. I felt terrible being so overweight, so I ran home from school every day and cut down on my eating. I also met some friends toward the end of the school year, and through the summer we spent every day hanging out and sometimes walking for miles. High school was much better. While some people say they hated it, I blossomed. I took up cross-country in my first year and ran through college. I was very slim in high school. I received a lot of attention from girls, but I was still awkward. However, I was always around people. I went to many house parties and stayed in touch with friends. I am glad my parents put me in public school. I have many fond memories I would not have had otherwise, and I know I would be a very different adult if I had not gone. It is not that I am not strange, but I can see how stilted and broken I could have become. I am not saying homeschooling is inherently bad, but if it is not combined with social programs, sports, and so on, it can be a disservice to children. My dad has always been skeptical, cynical, and antisocial. We were not homeschooled out of care for us as children, but because my parents were skeptical Republicans who believed the government was there to brainwash us. He is not entirely wrong. But the way the world works, unless you are already very wealthy, you cannot afford not to adapt. You have to meet societal norms and expectations, not just of other people but of the socioeconomic class you are born into. I am 34 now and on the way to making my own wealth, and even now I am still learning what it means to become wealthy. I had to break away from one of my best friends from that same school because he would not stop asking me for money and was passive-aggressive about my finances. No one told me all your life that you would become a new person and have to keep shedding people from your life. Story 137. Until well into my 30s, I believed that Arkansas had 2 different spellings and that they referred to 2 different states. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.